Welcome to video 7 in this series walking you through the steps of the collaborative world building process. Hopefully these videos have been useful even for those of you who are making your own worlds by yourself, but the catalog is really where we can leverage the group aspect of the project as the world can grow out very fast at this stage, which is always exciting. With all the work being done collaboratively up to this point, the catalog is a chance for people to have more control over individual entries, but there are also some dangers here. One is that with entries being made, inconsistencies or incoherencies will expand exponentially, and those are difficult to weed out later. Another is that contributors can go down their own world-building rabbit holes and never come out again. So before you start, make sure you've done the work of writing a good, specific meta-narrative, as a big part of the catalog management is making sure that your catalog entries accurately reflect the diversity of your world, and that your contributors continue to work on the same page as each other. At this point, you should have a well-crafted meta-narrative about 4,000 to 5,000 words that describes all the most interesting and unique features of your world and the various forces at play in society. Now, you get to populate the world with individual wiki entries that describe its people, places, things, historical events, and groups or organizations. You might have some other categories or subcategories, but these 5 cover the majority of entries. So first things first, the group should decide how many entries each person is willing and able to contribute. Usually I start with 10 per person. In my classes I will usually tell students to each make at least 2 characters, 2 locations, 2 items, and then the remaining 4 entries from whatever categories they want. If your group has 4 or 5 people, you're looking at 40 to 50 entries, which I think of being as sort of the critical mass for showcasing the diversity of your world. So the key is thinking through demographics. The basic idea is that when you think about all aspects of any given part of your world, it should add up to 100%. This isn't a difficult concept, but it winds up being extremely useful in terms of making sure aspects of your world are crystal clear. So for example, in a fantasy world, maybe the world's population is 40% human and 10% each of dwarves, elves, orcs, gnomes, halflings, and fairies. That's a 60-40 split. Humans make up less than half the population, but they also exist in 4 times greater number than any other species. And imagine how that may impact the politics of this world. You can slide those numbers around to reconfigure the population. What if the world is 40% humans, 40% dwarves, and less than 5% of all the other species? How would that change things? Let's shift gears from species to economic class. What if 5% of the population are rich, 5% are upper class, 20% are middle class, 50% are working class, and 20% are poor? You can do this for religious faiths, ethnicities, professions, ages, alien species, magic users, or whatever you want, just as long as all those categories add up to 100% of the population. This is a good time to ask, too, what is the population of your world? 100% of the population is 1,000 beings, 10,000, 100,000? The demographics should align with your meta-narrative and substructural values. Using this example, with 70% of the population being working class or poor and the wealth being concentrated in the top 10%, I would expect there to be significant class tensions. To add complexity, start by cross-referencing these demographics. This is particularly useful thinking about representation in the makeup of your catalog and hence your world. Going purely by mathematics, 8 out of every 10 characters would be a human or a dwarf, and 7 of 10 characters would be working class or poor. That brings up an interesting question. Who are the 3 that are middle class, upper class, or rich? I imagine it would make a huge difference in terms of the social relations if it's elves, who only make up 5% of the total population, made up 2/3 of the upper class and very rich. That would mean that most elves in this world would be well off. This idea of adding everything up to account for 100% of the world extends to locations and items too. So out of all the locations in the world, what percentage would be government buildings? How many factories? How many schools? How many guard outposts? How many items would be spellbooks or projectile weapons? Food items? Think about the qualities of the world you've built and the dominant forces on it. A world with a heavy religious influence would have lots of people who are part of the clergy, lots of holy sites and places of worship, and religious artifacts that people might wear or scripture they might read. Don't be a slave to the math and let it dictate the exact numbers of catalog entries for each type, but the demographic approach helps you situate your entries in terms of the makeup of the wider world. For example, let's say we've got 4 people making 10 entries each with the demographics of this fantasy world. They'll make about 40 entries, or we'll say that 10 of them will be characters, so 2 to 3 per person. Of those 10 characters, mathematically it would be 4 humans, 4 dwarves, and then 2 from the other 5 species. See how the math doesn't quite work out? So maybe the group agrees that they'll do 13 characters with 4 humans, 4 dwarves, and then 1 elf, gnome, orc, halfling, and fairy. They could also decide that fairies just aren't going to get any character entries, or they could trim down the number of species. Or they could decide that the minority race of fairies are the most interesting, and they're going to create 5 fairy characters, but emphasize in those entries that fairies are members of a minority species. Often the instinct is to create a billion entries, but projects really spiral out of control if you do that. Instead, focus on quality over quantity. What types of characters would find themselves living at conflict? At what points and items are the most representative of this world? I suggest students create a spreadsheet to identify the entries and then literally have them sign up or volunteer to write certain ones. So if everyone in the group agrees fairies are the most interesting, then everyone gets to create 1 fairy character entry. If elves are a wealthy minority, the group might want at least 1 or 2 elves. But wait a second, wouldn't that lone poor elf have a more interesting story? How did it happen that almost all elves are rich, except for this one? Ideally, your catalog is an accurate cross-section of your world that emphasizes its most important features and prominent aspects. When a group starts choosing up like this, they realize how quickly those 40 or 50 entries can get snatched up, and they also figure out which parts of the world no one is too keen to write about. I always feel like populating the catalog is one of the most fun parts of a world-building project, because it gives the creators individual freedom to come up with cool surprises and unique entries. If you're using a wiki, it's worth time to create links between entries, connecting characters and locations and items, or establishing relationships between characters. It's important to do a general accounting of these entries before you start, though, to ensure that you get a good, diverse range of entries, and it also encourages people to contribute to the broader world rather than just going down their own personal rabbit holes. The next video deals with plotting your catalog entries onto the physical space of the world using a map. Thanks for watching.